Love it. Okay, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Monica Smith, one of the co-creators of RevelEleven, along with Joni Parsons. Joni, wave.
Everyone.
We started RevelEleven around like 4 years ago with the goal of doing deep dives in topics that are meaningful to us as women. And I'm very excited for this evening's program with Ada because she recently wrote this fabulous book called Why We Can't Sleep, Women's New Midlife Crisis, which is what we'll be talking about tonight. But Ada is highly acclaimed for her past works, including a memoir called Wedding Toasts I'll Never Give, which I can't wait to read, and the book St. Mark's is Dead. Ada, before we start diving into your most recent work, please share a bit about your history and kind of like leading up to what inspired you to write this book.
Sure. So first of all, thanks so much for having me. This is really, what a fun group of women it seems like you have amassed out there. So yeah, so I had this book come out. I don't know. Oh my gosh, my crazy screen is gonna block it, but I'm saving you from seeing my messy bedroom. So anyway, St. Mark's is Dead was a book that I had come out like 5 years ago, and that was a history of the street that I grew up on in New York City. So I grew up in the East Village. I don't know if people out there know this neighborhood, but it's very bohemian and crazy, and punk rock, and that's where I grew up. And then a couple of years ago, I wrote a book called Wedding Toast I'll Never Give, which came out of a modern love column that I did where my husband and I had a big fight. And I immediately wrote about it for the New York Times, and it went really viral. And I got asked to write some more essays about marriage as it really is. And then I guess it was 2 years ago now, I was having a terrible summer. It was really bad. I had lost a bunch of work. I'm a freelancer, and just a ton of stuff had fallen through, and one kid was going into middle school and one was going into college, and it seemed like we had a lot of debt, and I didn't really know what the future held at all. And I got this call from an editor at Oprah.com asking me to write about our generation. She said, I'm having a really hard time. My friends are having a really hard time. I just read your last book about marriage. Sounds like you're having a hard time. Why don't you figure out why? And then I spent a few months writing this story, and then the story went really, really viral. And I just started getting these messages from women all over the country. And they were saying, thank you for saying this. I feel seen and heard in a way that I haven't in a while, because people don't talk about us. We're a generation that tends to get ignored. Gen X is historically very marginalized. We hear about the millennials and the boomers all the time, but not so much about those of us in the middle, who are now in our 40s and 50s. And then women in middle age tend to get ignored. We tend to be invisible. And so the article and then now the book is an attempt to sort of pay attention to us and what we're dealing with, which is quite significant, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, before we launch in, I just have to ask, like, what does your husband think when you write about your marriage? Like, did he know that it was going to appear?
Yes, I do. He knows. He is he is an excellent editor and reader. He would like me to write about him more. He is a performer, and he really enjoys when I write about him. In this particular case, it's actually quite funny because we had some friends I have a little house in the Catskills in upstate New York, and like a country summer place. And we were up there with some friends, and they were like, this is amazing. It's so fun. And I was like, yeah, you know why we have it? It's because you guys stayed out way too late that one night, and he overslept and missed a flight. And then I had to write about it for the New York Times to just make myself feel better. And then that sold as this book that let us buy the country house. Thank you. You're all welcome into my home that you have helped me build.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about like where our expectation of perfection comes from. Like, where did it start? Have other generations had that same expectation?
I think from what I've heard from a lot of experts that I've talked to, women have kind of a gene for this, like for wanting to sort of do more and be better and perfect themselves. But it seems like it took on some kind of new incarnation with us as a generation. And I think it had a lot to do with how we were raised with these mantras like, you can be anything, even president. There's nothing you can't do. The world is your oyster. And these were wonderful things to say to little girls. But somehow it happened. And I think it's because that all that rhetoric didn't come with a lot of support. So a lot of our parents were divorced. Something like 40% of us have divorced parents. That often meant that college wasn't getting paid for. It often meant that we had to find our own way. Most of us were latchkey kids. We had to, make our own snacks when we got home, make ourselves do our homework. So the support really didn't match what we were being told. So what I heard from so many women, and I interviewed about 200 women all over the country, many of them said that they felt like that idea that they could be anything meant they had to do everything. And they had to do it all perfectly. And it was all on them. And if they didn't do it right, if they didn't do a great job, there was no one to blame but themselves. So the book tries to argue that actually, there were a lot of forces at work beyond our own force of will.
Remind us the years for Generation X.
So 65, birth years of 1965 to 1980 is what you usually hear. From what I've heard from women, a lot of women who are kind of elder millennials or younger boomers tend to relate to that cohort too, though.
And do you think, Joni and I are the last year of the boomers. We were both born in 1964. And I feel like so many of the shows that we were watching in the 70s and the 80s kind of gave us this feeling like we could do anything, but it was still early on. So I'm trying to think of some of the popular shows, but like there was the movie Working Girl and Mary Tyler Moore's show for sure.
Yeah.
And I know that was really influential for us. And do you think that was just more of a continuation, that because we were going out there and starting to try to do it, that the next generation then had this pressure?
Yeah, well, it's funny. Somebody just wrote Murphy Brown in the chat.
Yes, yeah, totally.
Yeah, Murphy Brown. And actually one thing I love about Murphy Brown as an example is somebody wrote this in an article that I read a few years ago, but that was this idea like, oh yeah, she can do it all. She can have the super high powered, amazing job and all these close friends, and look amazing and have a baby. And then the article was like, but she also had the house painter / nanny who was at her beck and call 24 hours a day, Eldon. So this article was saying like the generational mantra could be, where's Eldon? There is no Eldon for us. There is only an Eldon for Murphy Brown. And okay, somebody also just mentioned the Enjoli perfume ad. So I did 200 or so interviews. I would say about half of those women sang to me the Enjoli perfume ad at some point in our conversation. There's something about that commercial, which I know a lot of you are probably humming right now at home. That's, I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in a pan, never let you forget you're a man, right? That's the opening lyric. It's like, I've watched a few versions of it. It's actually quite strange. She's like cooking bacon in a silk shirt. You shouldn't do that. Anyway, that kind of thing, this idea that you can, and then therefore you must be sexy, make money, take care of the kids, do all those things and look really fantastic at the same time. It was very insidious. I feel like we were subject to this brainwashing campaign.
I'm curious with like for the women that you interviewed who did achieve their career ambitions, say, did they seem more fulfilled overall?
Well, what's so interesting is, so I was self-selecting for women who were struggling, because the idea of the book was that women's struggles don't get paid enough attention to, that we hear about men's midlife crises all day long. There's, every Michael Douglas movie is about yet another, middle-aged man struggling. And you always see the sports cars and the girlfriends and all those things about men in middle age having a hard time. And you don't hear about women who maybe get to this stage of life and are frustrated. But I will say that a lot of the women I talked to saw what wasn't there. So women I talked to who were very successful, who were CEOs, they often said, yeah, but it came at a cost. And that was, I don't have a family or I don't have a social life. Whereas I also talked to women who had these families and hadn't had a lot of career success. And they too were saying, yeah, I've got this, but I don't have it all, as they say, as I think we were led to believe we should. Um,
Mhm.
that's not to say a lot of women don't feel fulfilled with just one or the other, but I think generationally, what I saw over and over again was this idea that we were supposed to do all the things, and
Mhm.
not doing all the things was somehow seen as a personal failing, and not as a very natural reaction to the fact that there's only so many hours in a day, and there's only so many things you really can accomplish and do a good job on, as a human person.
Yeah, I'm guessing there's a lot of situations where like someone works their butt off, they achieve their career goal, but then is their life falling apart? And so it's just, it's balancing those trade-offs. And everyone, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. But there is one that says, I'm 65 from Vicky, and I feel I was told many of the same things. How do we make more progress on this?
That's so great. Yeah, I mean, it's not great. It's terrible. But question, uh, I so one woman who I interviewed who's in the book, she's a woman in New Jersey, and she had all these career ambitions, and then because of a bunch of things that happened, she wound up taking care of her three children. One of them had a traumatic brain injury. She raised them, and then now she's in her 50s, and she misses having a career, and she was almost apologetic that she hadn't, and now how does she get into it, and the sense of frustration. But and I spent a couple of years in touch with her, and she wound up coming to a book event I did in Washington D.C., and she brought her daughter, and she said it was really important to her to show her daughter like what she said in the book and what I was saying and what the other women in the room were saying, so that her daughter could know that doing everything perfectly was something that we tried, and something that sometimes is possible, but not without cost. And that it was really important that she look at the things that she wanted to do most and prioritize them, and not beat herself up if she doesn't do everything else too. That she this woman who brought her daughter said she was really adamant to her daughter, I want you to be happy. That wasn't what my mother told me. My mother told me I had to achieve, I had to live all her dreams too. I just want you to be happy. I want you to be honest with yourself about what you want. So I think it's maybe about that for the next generation. Yeah, I said there's another question too about being the breadwinner, which a lot of women in this generation are. I am in my house. Um, and it's true, like you hear the rhetoric still, not only from our leaders, but just in society and TV shows and all this kind of stuff, that men are still perceived as the ones, the head of household, the ones in charge, when in most households women are earning at least half the money, in a lot of households, while also doing at least half of all the other work. And I think that one thing that makes me a little bit crazy is this idea that, in the 70s, women, marched into the workplace, but men didn't like march into the home, in the other direction to make it more possible for women to work the kind of hours that they needed to work to really get ahead. There's sort of an unfairness there, and this idea that somehow women should have been able to do everything, like kept the household running exactly the way it was before, and not when nobody else was making adjustments. Like we weren't getting maternity leave, we weren't getting healthcare, we weren't getting any of these other things that could have maybe helped a little bit. We were expected to somehow solve all those problems on our own.
Hmm. Talk a little bit about the money panic, and how generationally that you're seeing a lot of money panic with the Generation X.
So I wrote this book before the pandemic, and I've heard from a lot of women since the book came out that it's all the things are more true. Like it didn't, unfortunately, nothing was like nullified by the pandemic. A lot of the things became much more serious, and one of them is this issue of money. So as a generation, we have a ton of debt. Wages have not gone up significantly. The cost of living is so high, like for a regular middle class household. And the things that have gone up are things like housing and food and education, like really primal things. Um, and somehow we're expected to like be able to buy our own homes, even though they cost way, way more than they did for our parents, proportionally. So, what I heard was, and again, a lot of the women that I talked to blame themselves. They're like, oh, if only I could, not buy these coffees, these fancy coffees, everything would be okay. But it's a much bigger problem than that.
What would you say, doing all of the interviews, like what surprised you the most?
I heard so many of the same phrases, um, from women all over the country. And I interviewed a very diverse group of women. I tried to make it look like America. So, demographically, and I think I hit every state. I sort of tried to keep it mostly middle class, but otherwise, and that age range, but otherwise it was really diverse. Um, and they would say things like, I have no right to complain. I'm very lucky. And women in very dire situations would say that to me. And once I heard it like the 20th time, I'm like, what is going on? Why are all these women wanting to reassure me that they're fine, that everything's okay? They're not actually having a crisis. Yes, they know my book is about midlife crisis. They're not having one of those. And then they would proceed, to explain to me how they lost their job, they couldn't get back into the workforce because of ageism. They were divorced, they were raising 3 kids, they had no help from their ex, just that these very tough situations combined with these expectations they'd had for themselves going in to adulthood that had not been met. A lot of women I interviewed wanted desperately to have children and weren't able to for various reasons, and found themselves facing up to that at this age. These are hard issues. And I think that tendency of so many different women in so many different situations to minimize their feelings, to say they're not important, that was a real, like, a just something that I noticed, something I thought, that's weird that we are all so desperate to make sure that everybody knows we're fine.
It is a strange tendency, and I think there's such, it's some of the work that's out there about the power of intention and the power of positivity. I know that for me, going through a crisis, I find that I feel pressure to talk about the bright side.
Yeah.
And how, oh, this is just a little blip. So there is an interesting pressure, I think, on people to keep it positive. And particularly socially. Do you find that?
Yeah, that's really well said, Monica. And I think that women especially maybe find that to be true. But yeah, it's like positivity and also gratitude. And I do believe that practicing gratitude and trying to remind yourself of all the things you're lucky for, is good. It's like psychologically healthy. But there comes a point when if you keep telling women they have to just constantly feel gratitude all the time, they can also feel mad. I think that we can also be angry at certain things while we feel grateful for other things. Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing like some of the comments, people are talking about like getting like squeezed out of the workplace because of the pandemic. Do you see not being able to sleep generation getting worse? Yeah, like it seems like it's getting much worse. I'm seeing all these articles about how women far more than men are being pushed back into like now having to take care of the kids because they have to be their kids' teachers, right? Because of the at-home schooling, and that's just disproportionately affecting women. That when it comes to childcare, and also I talk in the book a lot about caregiving, which I'm doing now too. It's for elderly parents and for kids at the same time, it tends to fall on women and not on men. So that's gotten significantly worse.
Yeah, I guess going back to what we were talking about, with perception, I guess, our parents' generation, in the 50s, everyone tried to appear so perfect. And even Joni's comment about, isn't that a generational thing that, that our parents did this as well? And I have to say that, yeah, it does seem like the 50s started this trend of the picture perfect family. And yeah.
Yeah. And I think especially for women, there is a pressure to not take up so much space. This is something I've been thinking about so much lately, is like this, you know, women being like trying to be made smaller, right? And being scolded anytime they are loud or brash or any of these other things. Um, why like, why do we feel
Yeah.
like we can't take up room and can't be mad at, I was while I was working on the book, I this isn't in the book, but I was renting a workspace to try to get out of my like little apartment and have a thing. And there was this like, there were a lot of like tech bros everywhere in this work. It was like kind of a WeWorky thing. And I just remember one of them, just the sense of like confidence he had, and like the amount of space he took up, and just the idea that like he didn't even notice if people were mad at him, to the point where I would like be like scowling openly. Like, hey, I'm scowling at you. Like, look, I'm scowling. Go, don't talk right next to my desk loudly on your headset.
Mhm.
I want to be a little more like that. I don't know exactly how yet, but I think there's something about, not, I don't want to go that far, but one of my friends says like women should be like 10% more narcissistic, just like a little bit, just to get a little further maybe.
Well, how has it impacted some of your behaviors after doing the research and writing the book?
Oh, it really cured me. I was, before I did the book, I was like up every night around usually like between 2 and 4 in the morning. I just wake up and I'd stare at the ceiling and I would just think, why? Where did I go wrong? Like, why is everything terrible? Why do I have this debt? Why is my career in this place? Why is my kid's handwriting so bad? Like, I just roll through these anxieties until it was time to get up usually. And I don't do that now. I do wake up still sometimes, but I know why now. I mean, I think the book, it doesn't solve all their problems, but I do think it lays out a pretty good case for there being a lot of issues that are outside of us, a lot of forces that were at work on our generation.
So do you find that just acknowledging that there is this problem out there kind of soothes your mind and does allow you to get better sleep?
It definitely has for me. I think for me, there's nothing worse than uncertainty and not knowing, and blaming myself, and feeling like, what is going on? And that if I have those answers, it can be bad, but at least I know what it is. And there's such a freedom in that. There has been for me, such a liberation. There's that great James Baldwin line that I'm going to screw up, but something about like nothing can be changed, and not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that is not faced. I think that's something like that. And
Yeah.
I think about that a lot. Once and this goes, this is like, I think therapy 101 too, is like, once you know your problems and what the issues are and what's wrong, it just becomes so much clearer and so much easier. And maybe you can't fix everything immediately, but you're not just like grasping in the dark.
Yeah. Ada, would you be willing to read an excerpt?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Something from the introduction first, or?
Yeah, whatever you think.
Yeah. So an acquaintance told me she'd been having a rough time working at 3 jobs as a single mother since her husband left her. Determined to cheer up her family, she planned a weekend trip. After a long week, she started packing at 10 p.m., figuring she could catch a few hours of sleep before their 5 a.m. departure. She asked her 11-year-old son to start gathering his stuff. He didn't move. She asked again. Nothing. If you don't help, she told him, I am going to smash your iPad. He still didn't move. As if possessed, she grabbed a hammer and whacked the iPad to pieces. When she told me this, I thought of how many parents I know who have fantasized or threatened this very thing, and he or she had actually done it. I laughed. Yeah, my friends think it's a hilarious story too, she said, but in reality, it was dark and awful. Her first thought as she stood over the broken glass, I have to find a good therapist right now.
Awesome. Thank you. And Jane, thank you for sharing. I would like to see more women be real and lift one another up through mentoring, supporting, and coaching one another. We don't have to be all to all, and trying to be is bullshit. So thank you for sharing that, Jane. Let's go into social media. I'm dying to hear your perspective about the impacts of social media.
Yeah, I mean, so that was another thing I just heard over and over again in the interviews I did, was everybody else has it figured out. And they would like look at their phones, like, look at these people, they're fine. They have it all figured out. They're so happy. This is my friend from college. Look at her beautiful children who are all Olympic athletes, and look at her like sexy marriage. They're going to Italy again. There is something so toxic about these scrolls of other people's best moments. In terms of just, again, brainwashing us that we're flawed, that everybody else is doing better. It's proven, like, it makes us sad looking at those things. And one thing I argued to the point earlier of Jane's point about supporting one another and getting together, I completely agree. And one thing I advised in the book, that helped me so much, was making a club with other women. The club I started was for women journalists, and we met once a month, and we met at like a dive bar. So even if you were broke, you could still order drinks and not worry about it. And it was a life changer for me and for a lot of the women who went to it. And I was arguing in the book, like, get off the internet, like get in an actual room with actual other women where you can be honest with them, and not be afraid someone's going to screenshot it, and where you can look somebody in the eye and see they too have wrinkles that have not been airbrushed, on the computer. And now, of course, because of the pandemic, it's much, much harder to get off the internet and do those kind of things. So I'm looking for substitutes all the time. And, to some extent, it's been helpful doing these like, Zoom cocktail hours and things like that with some friends. But I'm really looking forward to being in a room with them again.
Yeah. Kirsten just had a really good point about, I think part of it is figuring out who we are. I mean, really are. I think we spend so much of our lives fitting into some definition that someone else wants for us: daughter, wife, mother, for some, boss, CEO, whatever. And maybe all of those roles fit, but are we really who we are? I found once I started answering that question, I started sleeping a lot better, and I'm a ton more comfortable in my skin.
Yeah.
Right on, Kirsten. I totally agree with you. And I do feel like now in my mid 50s, I care less and less about what people think of me. And it's been a lot easier to get in touch with who I really am. And I'm curious, Ada, what you found in your interviews.
It's so true. I don't know if it's the hormones that keep us trying to please people, and then once they start to go away in our 40s and 50s, like, we get more and more ourselves. But that's something that I've heard from a lot of my friends who were in their 50s and 60s, that there's something about the menopausal transition, which for most women is around 51, that on the other side of that, there is just this sense of like, I can just listen to myself. I don't have to listen to all of these other voices. And I feel that coming. I mean, I feel that changing in myself too. I think as you get more mature and more established, I think that comes, and thank God. Because I think that, because I think that perimenopausal state coincides with a time in our lives when we're trying to, often raise children, take care of aging parents, work full time, take care of all those really stressful life events. And by the way, we're being told to like lean in at the same moment. So I think there is, for me, there's a sense of there is something on the other side. There is some more peace, and I think that's well said, and I'm glad you see that too.
Yeah, I would love to offer some messaging to those who are younger, that they don't have to wait until menopause.
Yes.
So what are some of the lessons learned, and what messaging would you share? Yeah, this goes along with your chapter, New Narratives, which I absolutely loved that chapter. And I definitely want you to read an excerpt from that chapter. But will you first answer about like, what are some messages to the younger women in the audience?
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of the misery that I heard from women came from the contrast between their expectations and the reality that they experienced. So if they thought I'm gonna be the Anjali ad when I'm 40, and they got to 40 and they, you know, had a ton of credit card debt and their business had failed and they were divorced and they wanted kids that didn't have them, or they had 3 kids that were kind of wild, or whatever it was. I think reframing the story, and saying that the expectations were wrong. It's not necessarily the reality that's wrong. That it was thinking that it was supposed to be some other way. That I think helps a lot. I think realizing this is a hard stage of life. 30s, 40s, 50s for women. It's there's a lot going on, especially now because unlike our mothers and grandmothers, we usually are working full time while also doing a lot of the other caregiving and household stuff. So, why would we think it would be easy? And so it's about sort of recasting the story where it's not like we screwed up, we failed, but it's like the dice were loaded against this particular fantasy we were led to believe was possible.
I would love for you to share maybe some other tools that you would recommend. So that tool sounds like it's just shifting your narrative.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
That's correct. And then I would say
Okay.
also just realizing this is a period of time, that all of these things hitting at once, which they tend to in middle age. So this is a time that ends, like we were saying earlier. And I think getting support. One thing that a lot of the women I interviewed said was that they just felt like they had nobody helping. Not the government in terms of programs that might make all the things they were trying to do possible, not their partners who maybe had more traditional ideas about what the division of labor should be, um, and not their workplaces, which often had this idea that the more hours you show up, the more capable you are, when they knew they could get the job done in less time and they wanted more flexible schedules. So I think that figuring out how to get support for me, I realized that I was trying to do everything, even little things that there was no reason for me to do them necessarily. So, I think of it as like Ocean's 11, like where you get the lock picker and the computer guy and all these different people who you need. So I got somebody to like do my computer stuff for me, and I got like the girl upstairs to be our like pet sitter, and I just sort of found this team of like, I got a good accountant, I found a good gynecologist. I really just expanded this Rolodex of people that I could call if I had any need of any kind, and it really transformed things. And I also just sort of made people in my household do more. I was like, my kid has to clean his own room. My husband has to get the groceries. Like, and just saying what I needed explicitly made a big difference.
How about relying on your girlfriends?
Yeah. Well, like I said before, that club, I mean, it really changed my life. Having a situation where I knew at least once a month for at least 2 hours, I was going to see this group of women, and we could say anything to one another. And we knew each other's backstories. We just, there was a shorthand. We had a similar kind of work experience where we could be like, oh my God, this agent's driving me crazy, or whatever it was. And it was, it really changed a lot of our lives, I think, just having that outlet and that support. And I could call them anytime during the month and, vent or ask for advice.
Um, Monica just shared a great point. Thank you so much. I think we have to have these discussions with young women in our circle as well as our sons. Right on. I only have sons, and I have tried to make them aware of the unrealistic expectations for women and for them. And I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I should have said that, and I totally agree because I have sons too. I have a stepson who's 26, and I have a son who's 14. They are both like they both know way more than their peers about perimenopause and about the wage gap, because they come to my book events a lot, and they're lovely boys and very supportive. And my older one is in medical school. He's going to be a physical therapist, and they can specialize. And he's like, why aren't people specializing in menopause, like and treating this like age group? It's like, it's really fascinating, and it's so under heralded. So yeah, I agree. I think it's about making sure that they know that they have to help. They have to support the women in their lives. And
Yeah, and I think modeling good behavior, like recognizing that for working mothers, that they shouldn't be assumed to be doing all of the laundry and the cooking and everything else. And so having those healthy conversations with sons and brothers and husbands and is just a great thing.
good
I do
practice.
like this JC, proper delegation equals support systems, and that's so true.
Mhm. That's really good. Yeah, and also the sort of relying on one another, like in a community. I think that that's something that this generation has not benefited from as much as past generations. So, part of it is like church attendance is way down, club attendance is way down. It used to be like if our grandmothers like, were sick and needed help, like she would have a bunch of casseroles on her doorstep, and there were just a lot of people who could watch the kids in the neighborhood and that kind of thing. And that's just not something that our generation has at its disposal as much. So we really have to work hard, I think, to create those networks.
Yeah. Will you please read an excerpt from that beautiful chapter on new narratives?
Sure.
And everyone else, please think of questions and put them in the chat. That would be great.
There are some great comments. I have to say also this comment where I've lost, I was like keeping up with everything and now I'm a few behind, but I did like somebody saying that they've been up since 4 a.m. And,
Yeah.
and it's 9 o'clock now. Okay, so I'm just going to read a page from the new narrative section at the end of the book. So I sort of talk about reframing and that kind of thing. And I say you could say that this attitude comes down to the old cliche about looking on the bright side. But I think it's more profound than that. It's about telling the story of our mistakes, our life in a new way, in which we're heroines worth rooting for. When teaching memoir classes, I've talked about making meaning in the process of structuring a story. What is the beginning, the middle, the end? What are the key plot points? What are the most moving scenes? Deliverance from suffering in midlife could come from some outside force, but it could also come from reframing your life as being about something unexpected. Many of the inspirational authors women I talked to recommended to me, including Barbara Bradley Haggerty, Brene Brown, Elizabeth Gilbert, Cheryl Strayed, speak of recasting and rethinking our lives. In a recent op-ed about midlife, Anne Voskamp wrote, "Life doesn't have to get easier to be good." Maybe the Generation X story need not be we're broke, we're unstable, we're alone. Maybe it can be we've had a hard road to hoe, we've been one big experiment, and yet look at us, we've accomplished so much. Generation X women who as children lacked cell phones and helicopter parents came up relying on our own wits. To keep ourselves safe, we took control. We worked hard and made lists and tried to do everything all at once for a very long time and without much help. We took responsibility for ourselves, and later we also took responsibility for our work or partners or children or parents. We should be proud of ourselves.
That's wonderful. Thank you. You had mentioned something about sharing lessons learned and sharing mistakes. And I think that it's something that is really difficult for our society to do. And I think women generally are pretty good at it. But it's one of the reasons why Joni and I started RevelEleven, is to have the opportunity for older women to share some of the mistakes or lessons learned to younger women. And that's been a really meaningful part of our conversations. Did you find in your research that people were open about mistakes that they had made, or not?
It seemed to me like there was often this sort of shame around certain things. Like I would say the things that people seem to have the most shame around were either like money, like if they had a lot of debt, if they felt like they they weren't making very much money or they weren't spending it right or whatever, and that they didn't want to admit that, or if their marriage was sort of unfulfilling in some way. These were things that that it took a minute for them to feel comfortable sharing. Um, and one thing that I think is proven is that this shame around mistakes, around failures, around things that don't feel quite right. Um, that's like the worst. The worst part is the shame around it. I mean, anything can be conquered. Like any debt can be dealt with. Any marriage can be made better. These are all things that can be dealt with, but not if they're buried under like mountains of shame. So I think my goal with actually the Wedding Toast book and then also this book has been, at least get rid of that part of it. This idea that you're alone, that everyone else is okay, that, that it's not normal to be having a hard time. I think getting rid of that enables us to really have honest conversations and make things better.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes me think of the event that we had last week on women's relationship with alcohol. And I know some of you were on that call with us, but shame was a big piece of the difference sometimes with men and women, and not that that's even important, but that people avoid seeking help because of the big shame. And I'm guessing that's also so true about feeling shame around not being able to do it all.
I think that's right.
And so they don't seek that help or the support structure.
Yeah. And I think Brene Brown has done a lot of really kind of ingenious things around shame and around this idea of like, how do you respond to it? And do you kind of shut down? Do you like overperform? And that was, I think she was saying like a lot of women just tend to like try to do more and more and more and more. And it can become this kind of hamster wheel of trying things. And, and one thing that also a lot of the women I interviewed said is that, they were kind of always on like either a new diet or a new self-help book or a, new cleanse or a new meditation app. And it was just this kind of constant struggle to find the next thing. And that just kept them distracted from, their feelings.
She writes brilliantly around vulnerability and coming from or leading from a place of vulnerability. I love her work around that, which goes along with Kirsten, what you shared about our generation does seem to be in younger generations have the confidence and closeness of relationships and being vulnerable with one another. And that's such a beautiful thing, because I do think that our parents' generation may have had casseroles in common, but I didn't see many close relationships that are as loving and supportive and open and vulnerable as what I am seeing today. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
I think that's lovely. And I think that is true among female friendships. I also think it's true among in marriages that there was this. I think now it is true that men do a lot more caregiving of like kids. They change more diapers. They are more present, and that marriages and relationships tend to be more, progressive and honest and open.
I agree, Monica, who said everyone needs a person they can call and say, I'm going to say some horrible things and I just need you to listen. It's so true.
Very true.
Okay, how about other questions from the audience? You can feel free to unmute yourself or just put it in the chat. We are all ears.
This is great. I think some people saying yes, definitely 2 to 4 a.m. Dark times.
That's my nemesis, is probably 2 to 4.
Yeah. It's funny. I was hearing from so many women that was couple hours that they were awake. And I was like, are we supposed to be meeting up somewhere? Is there like, are we all waking up so that we're all supposed to meet in the town square and like plot?
Well, I have a confession. When we were first doing research on you, we thought that your book was about sleep and how to sleep better.
A lot, there are
kind
a lot of 1-star reviews on Goodreads that are like, this is not a sleep self-help book. And actually, speaking of Goodreads, if anybody is on Goodreads, the book today got nominated for Best Nonfiction Book of the Year. And so there's voting going on. So if you're on Goodreads and want to lift the
Oh
book up,
yeah.
then please do.
Well, congratulations on that. The feedback that you're getting is just fabulous. We do have a sleep event coming up that I'm excited about that really is about like, it's a naturopath. So maybe between this and that, we will all get some better sleep. Good question, Joni. What is your next project?
Oh, well, I just turned it in, and it's a memoir actually about my father. It's a kind of a complicated, weird memoir, but it's my father was a poet in the 60s, and he tried to write a biography of his hero, this poet named Frank O'Hara, who was the leader of the New York School of Poetry in New York, where I grew up, in the Village, and he failed. He didn't do it, and I found all his materials. I found all his old tapes, and so I tried to finish it. I tried to like do the book he wanted to do, and I didn't wind up doing that book, but I wound up spending a lot of time with my dad, who got a cancer diagnosis right when I was doing this, and so it became kind of a memoir about his his being sick, and about being a writer, and 3 generations of writers, and being in New York, and that kind of thing.
Wow,
I will figure out before it comes out how to describe it better than that, but that's what I just turned in.
well, I mean, you did a nice job. It sounds like it was probably a very intense and meaningful experience. I can only imagine.
It
Well,
was, and I was joking with my husband, like, my next book should be like, about kittens or something like that. Like really depressing, like, money panic stuff, and then like my dying father, and something happy. So if you have suggestions, please email me your
you
suggestions.
got it.
Happy books.
Well, best of luck on that. And I'm dying to know, share with us what brings you joy in life.
I mean, spending time with my husband and son. We've been taking like these really long walks together all pandemic, and they're just good company. I like them very much. Scrabble, really like Scrabble. We got a kitten last year. Great kitten, really good cat, weird cat, but a lot of pleasure from that animal.
Well, Ada, thank you so much for joining us. And again, everyone, why we can't sleep.
Thank
Such a
you.
joy
Great
to spend the
question.
evening with you.